The stage from Wichita arrived 40 minutes late, which suited Miriam Voss just fine. She used the time to watch. From the window of the coach, she had already cataloged most of what mattered about Coldwell, Kansas before the wheels stopped turning. The main street ran east to west and caught the afternoon light at a flat, unforgiving angle. 3 saloons, 2 churches, 1 telegraph office. The gap between the land office and the assayer told her something too wide, like a tooth pulled out, and the neighbors not yet shifted to fill the space. The men standing outside Pruitt's general store had the posture of people with nowhere particular to be, which meant either prosperity or defeat, and the condition of their boots suggested the latter. She noted all of this without moving. It was a habit she had developed over 8 years of sitting in a room adjacent to powerful men and being expected to be invisible. You learn to see everything from a position of apparent stillness. You learned that the information you gathered quietly was worth more than anything you might ask for directly. When the stage finally shuddered to a stop, she was the last passenger to step down. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her single bag in her hand and let the town arrange itself around her. A boy sweeping outside the barber shop. 2 women crossing toward the post office who slowed almost imperceptibly when they saw her. A dog sleeping in the shade of a water trough, indifferent to everything. The smell of dry grass and horse and something faintly metallic underneath it. All the particular smell of a place that had been worked hard and was not finished. Being worked. Then she saw him. He was standing outside the land office, not the general store as she had half expected, and he was watching her with the particular quality of attention that belongs to men who have spent years making accurate assessments of things. He was taller than she had constructed from his letters, though his letters had given her very little to construct from. 4 sentences. The date of her arrival. The location of his property relative to the main road. The condition of the spare room. His name at the bottom written with the economical clarity of a man who had no interest in ornamentation. Callum Drought was somewhere past 40 with a face that had been weathered by sun, and something else that was not sun, and he moved across the street toward her with the measured deliberateness of a man who had stopped being in a hurry a long time ago. He looked at her hands before he looked at her face. She noticed that. She filed it. He stopped 2 feet away and said, "Mrs. Voss." "Not yet," she said. "Still Voss for another day or 2, I'd imagine." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a reaction, more like a recalibration. He picked up her bag before she offered it and turned toward the far end of the street without further ceremony. She followed him. The people of Coldwell watched this with the restrained intensity of a town that has learned to record everything and display nothing. Miriam felt it across her shoulder blades, that particular weight of collective observation. She did not adjust her posture or her pace. The wedding took place the following morning in the small cedar-smelling room behind the church that Reverend Boone used for purposes that required privacy and brevity. He was a lean man in his late 50s with careful eyes and the practiced neutrality of someone who had presided over enough Coldwell business to know which questions were useful and which were not. He asked none. He opened his book, read what was required of him, and waited. They said what was required of them in turn. When Reverend Boone opened the register and set it on the table, Callum signed first. His signature was the same as his letters, clear, unornamented, the hand of a man who had written his name on a great many official documents and had long since stopped thinking of it as anything other than a formal act. He passed the pen to Miriam. She looked down at his name. Then she looked at the line below it, where her own name would go. The pen was in her hand. The room was quiet. Boone was looking somewhere between them with the practiced distance of a man paid to witness things without appearing to. Miriam set the pen to paper and signed. It was a full second before she did it. No one mentioned the pause. But Callum, she would realize later, had been watching her hands. The Drought property sat 2 miles west of town, on a stretch of land that was neither impressive nor neglected. It was the kind of place shaped entirely by function. The fences were sound. The barn was well maintained, and the house was small and solidly built with a covered porch that would catch the afternoon shade in summer and hold the cold in winter. A kitchen garden ran along the south wall. Someone had planted it with care and then let the edges go slightly wild, which told her something about the person who tended it without telling her enough. Callum carried her bag inside. He showed her the spare room, the pantry, the pump out back. He did this with the economy of a man giving directions to a place he knew completely. No flourishes, no apology, no attempt to present the house as something better than it was. It was what it was. He appeared to have made his peace with that. Miriam stood in the kitchen and looked around with the quiet attention she gave most things. The shelves were organized by type rather than frequency of use, which was the system of a man who lived alone and had never needed to optimize for speed. The woodbox was stacked to exactly the right height, no higher. The table had been recently scrubbed. She could smell the lye, and there were 2 chairs at it, which was new. She was reasonably certain there had only been one before she arrived. "You keep a tidy house," she said. "I keep a functional one," he said. She nodded once. "That works for me." He looked at her for a moment longer than seemed strictly necessary. Then he went out to the barn, and she began reorganizing the pantry shelves by frequency of use, because there was no point in waiting to be settled before she started being useful. The first 6 weeks established a rhythm without either of them discussing it. Miriam cooked. Callum worked the property and did not comment when he noticed she had already identified 3 places along the south fence line where the posts needed resetting before winter, or when the latch on the garden gate stopped sticking after she spent 20 minutes with a file and a careful eye. She did not enter the room off the barn where his tools were hung in a specific order she recognized immediately as deliberate. She did not touch the locked cabinet in the study by the front window. They ate at the same table in the evenings. The conversation was spare and not uncomfortable the way silence between 2 people who have each learned not to waste words tends to be not uncomfortable. He asked practical questions. She gave practical answers. Occasionally, one of them said something that was not strictly practical, and they both let it pass without remark. One evening in the 3rd week, he came in from fixing the north fence line and sat down across from her at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a moment before looking up. "Where did you come from before Cincinnati?" he said. It was the first personal question he had asked her. Miriam looked at her own plate. She had been waiting for this question the way you wait for weather you have been watching build on the horizon, knowing it is coming, not entirely certain what it will bring. "A long way from here," she said. He nodded as though this answered something. He did not press further. But she noticed when she glanced up that he was still watching her. Not with suspicion, with the careful patience of a man who had learned that what people did not say was usually more interesting than what they did. It was the first time she felt the particular discomfort of being seen by someone who was actually looking. She thought about Cincinnati for a long time that night, lying in the spare room with the Kansas wind working at the eaves. She thought about the document she had read by accident 2 years ago, a set of land transfer agreements that had been left on her desk with a stack of correspondence she was meant to file. She thought about the language of those agreements, the particular way the subordinate clauses had been constructed on page 3, in a smaller font than the rest, the way you would construct something you needed to be present for legal purposes and visible for practical ones. She thought about the moment she had understood what she was reading, and then understood what that meant, and then sat very still for a long time before going back to work as though nothing had happened. She thought about Aldridge and the conversation that followed 3 days later, and the offer he had made her a promotion, erased the quiet and mutual understanding that some things were better left unexamined. She thought about what she had said to him. She thought about the copy she had made before she said it, folded into the lining of her second-best coat. She thought about the name she had seen mentioned in one of those documents, the name of the property from which the land was being aggregated, the name of the county, the name of the former marshal who had apparently investigated and then inexplicably stopped. Callum Drought. She had not come to Coldwell entirely by accident. She let herself think this clearly alone in the dark, and then she filed it away in the same place she filed all the things that were true, but not yet useful, and she went to sleep. In the mornings before he went out to the property, Callum read whatever newspaper had come in on the weekly stage. He did this at the kitchen table with his coffee, reading slowly and without apparent urgency, and he was precise about returning the pages to their original order when he finished. One Tuesday in the 4th week, Miriam was washing the breakfast dishes when she heard him set the paper down with slightly more deliberateness than usual. She did not turn around. After a moment, she heard him push back his chair. He set the paper on the edge of the table nearest her, not quite handed to her, not quite left as an afterthought, and went outside. She dried her hands and picked it up. On page 3, below a notice about the county fair, and above a brief report on a land dispute, 3 townships over was a small announcement. The Edelman property southwest quarter section was to be auctioned the following month. The announcement was written in the standard language of county legal notices, dry and precise, except for one word choice on the second line. The property was being auctioned at the petition of the purchasing party, not at the decision of the court, which meant it had not been a foreclosure, which meant the Edelmans had signed something. Miriam had spent 8 years reading documents that were designed to appear simpler than they were. She knew the difference between the language a man used when he was making a willing choice and the language a man used when he had been maneuvered into believing he had a willing choice. This announcement had the second quality all through it, like a hairline crack in good china that you only see when the light hits it at the right angle. She set the paper back on the table exactly where Callum had left it. That evening at dinner she did not mention what she had seen, but she asked him as she cleared the plates whether he knew the Edelmans. He was quiet for a moment. "I know most people in Coldwell," he said. Are they leaving voluntarily? He looked at her across the table with that measuring quality she had come to recognize, the quality of a man adding things up without showing the arithmetic. What makes you ask that? The announcement was written by the purchasing party's representative, she said, not the county recorder. A pause, not long. That's an unusual thing to notice, he said. I spent 8 years noticing things in documents, she said. It becomes a reflex. Callum sat with that for a moment. Then he said, the Edelmans are leaving because they signed a contract 18 months ago that had a clause they weren't told about. They're not the first. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a dry paper sound. How many? She said. 7 families. That I know of. Miriam put the dishcloth down on the counter and turned to look at him directly. This was the most he had volunteered at once, and she understood instinctively that it had cost him something to say it, though she did not yet understand why. Who's running the contracts? Callum looked at his hands on the table. A man named Harlan Sess. He's been coming through Coldwell for 3 years. He represents a land acquisition company out of Wichita, though the company's principals are from further east than that. He paused. I used to know more about what he was doing. I stopped looking into it. Why? He stood up from the table. Because it was the right thing to do at the time, he said with the particular flatness of a man repeating a conclusion he had worked hard to reach and was not entirely at peace with. He went out to the porch without further explanation. Miriam stood in the kitchen for a while after he left. 3 days earlier at Pruitt's store, the woman behind the counter had asked her in the friendly, thorough way of a woman who considered social inventory part of her professional duties where she had come from before Milford. Miriam had answered honestly Cincinnati 8 years with a law office, a change of circumstances. She had not thought about it again. She thought about it now. She was not a woman given to acting on incomplete information. She preferred to understand the full shape of a thing before she moved toward it. But she was also practical enough to recognize when a shape was becoming clear enough to act on, even if the edges were still uncertain. She thought about the document in the lining of her coat. She thought about 7 families. She went to bed without making any decisions, which was itself a kind of decision. It was the boy who broke her open. She had not expected that. She had prepared herself for a great many things, had thought carefully about the various ways this situation might develop and how she would respond to each. She had not prepared for a child. He was 8, maybe 9, and he appeared at the edge of the kitchen garden on a Saturday morning when Callum was in Coldwell for supplies. He stood at the gate the way children stand when they have been told to do something difficult by an adult and are trying to muster the specific courage that difficulty requires. He was wearing clothes that had been mended more times than they had been replaced, and his boots were too large for him, which meant they were borrowed or inherited. Miriam was on her knees pulling out a section of bindweed that had gotten into the bean rows. She looked up at him and waited. He came to the gate. He held out a folded piece of paper, the way a child holds something out when they are afraid it might be taken from them and they haven't quite committed to giving it up yet. My mother said to give this to the marshal's wife, he said. The former marshal's wife, Miriam said, wiping her hands on her apron and standing up. What's your name? Otto Edelman. She took the paper gently, the way you take something from a child's hands when you want them to understand you are receiving it properly. "Thank you, Otto." He watched her unfold it. Then he said, in the tone of someone passing along a message they have memorized carefully, "She also said to tell you that she knows you're new here, and you probably only know what Mr. Drought tells you. And she said that was probably enough to keep you comfortable, so you probably wouldn't want to know more. But she wanted to send it anyway." Miriam looked at the boy for a moment. Then she looked at the paper. It was a single page, handwritten in the careful script of a woman who had been taught to write well and had not had much occasion to write since. It described a meeting. A man from Wichita who had come to speak with her husband about their debt situation. The drought of 2 years past had left them stretched thin, and the man had a solution. A purchase arrangement that would let them stay on the land as tenant farmers while liquidating the ownership liability. He had explained it thoroughly. Her husband had asked questions. The man had answered them. They had signed. 18 months later, they received a notice. The clause on page 3, paragraph 4, subsection B, a requirement to complete certain improvements to the southeast pasture within the contract period. Improvements they had not known were required. Improvements they had not completed because they had not known. The clause was very clearly written. It was simply written in a place and manner that made it very easy not to read. At the bottom of the page, in smaller writing as though added after the fact, "There are 6 other families. We have all compared our contracts. The same clause, the same language, the same page. We have tried to find a lawyer willing to take the case. We have not found one in Coldwell. We understand why." Miriam refolded the paper. She looked at Otto Edelman, who was watching her with the particular watchfulness of a child who has been asked to do something important by someone he loves. "Tell your mother I received it," she said. "Tell her I read it." He nodded and turned to go. "Otto." He stopped. "Is your family still in Coldwell?" "For now," he said. "Until November." She watched him walk back down the lane toward the road. He was small against the flat expanse of the Kansas plain, and he walked with the serious, deliberate gait of a child who had recently discovered that the world was not arranged in his favor and had decided to keep walking anyway. She stood in the garden for a while after he turned onto the main road and disappeared. The bean rows needed finishing. The bindweed would come back if she left the roots. The sky was the flat, bright blue of a September morning with no weather in it yet. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and unfolded the paper again. She read it a second time more slowly, with the part of her mind she usually kept very quiet, the part that had spent 8 years reading what documents said underneath what they appeared to say. And what this document said underneath its careful and heartbroken accounting of facts was this: someone had designed a system, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a system with consistent language and consistent placement and consistent execution across at least 7 families in 1 county in Kansas, which meant there were almost certainly more counties, which meant there was almost certainly more money involved than the land itself was worth at current prices, which meant someone further east than Harlan Sess had decided that this particular stretch of the country was worth acquiring by the mile rather than the acre, and had hired competent people to do it in a way that would survive legal scrutiny. She thought about what Callum had said. 7 families. That I know of. I used to know more about what he was doing. I stopped looking into it. And then, very quietly, she thought, he didn't stop because he gave up. She was still sitting at the table with the paper in front of her when she heard Callum's wagon coming up the lane. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. He came in with the supplies and set them on the counter and began putting things away, and she watched him do this with new attention. Not the attention she had given him in the first weeks, which was the attention of a woman assessing a stranger, but something different, something with more weight in it. "Callum," she said. I'd like to go to town tomorrow," she said. "I'd like to call on Mrs. Ida Cray." He was quiet for a moment with his back to her, his hands still on the shelf. "Why?" he said. Just the one word with nothing inflected on it. "I want to introduce myself properly," she said. "I've been here 6 weeks. It seems past time." He turned and looked at her. Whatever he was reading in her face, he was thorough about it. "Ida Cray is not particularly interested in being called on," he said. "Nevertheless," said Miriam. Another pause longer this time. "I have some things I need to do in town myself tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll drive you in." "Thank you," she said. She started putting the rest of the supplies away and he went out to the barn, and nothing more was said about it. But she noticed when she was setting the last of the flour on the shelf that the paper in her apron pocket felt heavier than a single page of handwriting had any right to feel. She did not sleep well that night. Not because of fear. Miriam had long since made her separate peace with fear and knew how to sleep in its company. She did not sleep well because she was thinking, which was a different problem entirely. She was thinking about what she was about to do and whether it was the right thing, and how those two questions, which should have been the same question, kept sliding apart when she tried to hold them together. She was also thinking about the locked cabinet in the study, the one she had not entered because it was not her space, and she had understood that from the first day. She was thinking about what might be inside it, and whether what was inside it was what she suspected might be inside it, and what it would mean if she was right. She got up before dawn and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around the cup, and watched the flat black of the Kansas plain resolve itself slowly into shape and color as the sun came up behind the house, the kitchen garden, the near pasture, the line of the fence posts going west toward the road, and beyond that the town she had chosen. Or had she, and what was in the town, waiting for her to walk toward it? She heard him get up sometime after 5. She heard his boots on the floor of the room across the hall and the particular sequence of sounds that meant a man was making himself ready to go out and do work in the cold morning. She poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table without turning around, and after a moment she heard him sit down. They drank their coffee in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms without quite learning each other, and who had both, for their separate reasons, decided that this was enough to build on. When he set down his cup, she said, "Before we go to town today, I want you to know that I'm going to ask her about the contract." He said nothing. "I've seen the language before," she said. "The clause on page 3. I know the drafting style. I know the office that writes contracts in that style." Still nothing. But he had not moved. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," she said. I'm telling you where I'm going because I think you already know why, and I think you've been waiting to see whether I would get there on my own or not." She picked up her cup and drank the last of it and set it down. "Now you know." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark said something brief and definitive about the morning and then fell silent. Callum stood up. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. He looked at her for a long moment, the same measuring look, but with something underneath it. Now that hadn't been there before, something that was not quite recognition and not quite relief, but was adjacent to both. "I'll have the wagon ready at 8, he said. And he went out. Miriam sat alone in the kitchen in the early morning light and felt for the first time since she had stepped down from a stage in Coldwell, Kansas with a single bag and a folded document in the lining of her coat that she was in the right place. Not safe, not certain, but right. She got up and started making breakfast. The road to Coldwell ran straight west through flat land that the morning light made briefly beautiful, before the day got too bright for beauty and settled into usefulness. Callum drove without talking. Miriam sat beside him on the bench seat of the wagon and watched the road and thought about Ida Cray. What she knew, a woman in her early 50s, widowed some years back, ran the small dry goods store at the east end of town. Had been among the first property disputes in the county, according to what Callum had said in the kitchen 3 weeks ago. Was generally regarded in Coldwell as a difficult person, which Miriam had found in her experience was almost always code for a person who said true things that other people preferred not to hear. She did not know whether the woman would speak to her, whether she would trust a wife of Callum Drought, who had looked into this matter, and then stopped to carry whatever she had to say, whether when the door opened, she would be believed. They reached Coldwell just before 9. Callum pulled up in front of Pruitt's and helped her down from the wagon with the deliberate courtesy of a man who had decided without discussing it that whatever she was about to do deserved to be treated with some dignity. "I'll be here when you're done," he said. She nodded. She started east along the boardwalk. Ida Cray's dry goods store had a sign that needed repainting and a front window so clean it made the rest of the storefront look worse by comparison. Miriam pushed the door open and went in. The woman behind the counter was exactly what she had expected, and nothing like what she had imagined. Sturdy, direct-eyed, with the particular stillness of a person who has been angry for a long time and has learned to keep it in a place where it will not wear her out. She looked at Miriam without warmth and without hostility and without any particular interest in concealing either. "Mrs. Drought," she said. "Mrs. Cray." Miriam stopped in front of the counter. "I won't take much of your time." "You're here on his behalf," Ida said. It was not a question. "I was," Miriam said. "I'm not now." Something in Ida Cray's expression shifted. Almost nothing the way the surface of water shifts, but for a wind you can't yet feel from where you're standing. She looked at Miriam for a long moment with the measuring quality of a woman who had learned the hard way to be very careful about which people she allowed to stand on her side of a counter. "The contract you signed," Miriam said. "The clause on page 3. Do you have your copy?" Ida looked at her for another long moment. Then she reached under the counter, opened a drawer, and produced a folded document without a word. She set it on the counter between them. Miriam picked it up and read it. She read all of it not quickly, not performatively, but with the complete and focused attention of someone who has learned that the most important thing in a document is almost never on the first page. When she finished, she set it down. "This clause was not explained to you," she said. "No," Ida said. "If I could show you that the same clause in the same language appears in the contracts of at least 6 other families in this county, would you be willing to have your copy witnessed by someone other than Reverend Boone?" A pause. "Reverend Boone signed mine," Ida said carefully. "I know," Miriam said. The two women looked at each other across the counter. Outside, a wagon went past on the main road, and the sound of it faded into the flat prairie quiet. And then there was nothing but the two of them in the small, warm space of the dry goods store, with its smell of feed and cotton and linseed oil. "Sit down," Ida Cray said finally. Miriam sat down, and the door was still open behind her, and the morning was still bright outside it. And in front of Pruitt's General Store 2 miles up the road, Callum Drought sat on the bench seat of his wagon and waited and watched the east end of town and thought about what his wife was doing and whether he had made the right choice in saying nothing to stop her. He decided after a while that he had. The morning Miriam understood how much she did not yet know she was standing at the kitchen window, watching Callum fix a section of fence in the near pasture. He worked the way he did everything without wasted motion, without pause to assess his progress, as though the gap between deciding to do something and completing it was a distance he had learned to make very short. She watched him drive a post with 3 strikes where another man would have used 5. And she thought, this is a man who has been precise about things for a long time. Precision like that is not natural. It is practiced. It comes from having learned at some specific cost that imprecision is expensive. She had been in Coldwell for 6 weeks. She had been in this kitchen for 6 weeks at this window, watching this man. And she understood, standing there with her coffee cooling in her hands, that she had been reading him the way she read documents, looking for the structure underneath the surface, the clauses that explained the main text. She had found some of them. She had not found all. He looked up from the fence line. Not at her, at something further west, some quality of the light or the wind that had caught his attention. He stood still for a moment with the post driver in his hands, and his face turned into the weather coming off the plain. Then he went back to work. Miriam refilled her coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. She thought about what Ida Cray had told her 3 days ago, sitting in the back of the dry goods store, with the door pulled half closed, and her voice kept low out of long habit, rather than immediate necessity. The story came out in pieces the way old damage tends to, not as a clean narrative, but as a series of separate moments that had each seemed survivable on their own, and only in combination made clear the full weight of what had happened. Her husband, Gerald, had died of a chest ailment 4 winters back, leaving her the store and 12 acres on the west edge of town. A year and a half ago, a man named Harlan Sess had come through and presented what he described as a security arrangement, a way of using the land's deed value to stabilize the store's accounts during a lean year, without actually selling anything. It had seemed the way Ida described it, like a solution rather than a trap. The man had been patient. He had answered questions. He had a very good suit. She had signed. She found out about the clause 8 months later when a letter arrived from a land office in Wichita informing her that the improvement conditions of her agreement had not been met and the purchasing option had been triggered. She had not known there was a purchasing option. She had not known there were improvement conditions. She had hired a lawyer from Hutchinson who told her after reviewing the document for 2 days that the contract was valid. The clause is legal, he had said. The process of presenting it was not honest, but dishonesty is not illegal, Mrs. Cray. Particularly not in a land contract in Kansas. She had 3 months left before the option exercise date. Miriam had listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she had asked Ida for the name of the Wichita land office. She had asked for the names of the other families she knew of who had signed similar contracts. She had asked whether anyone had compared the contract language across cases. Ida had looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You know what this looks like, don't you? What it actually is." "I know what the documents say underneath what they appear to say," Miriam told her. "Yes. And you're Callum Drought's wife." "I am." "He knew about this," Ida said. Not an accusation. A fact being placed on the table between them carefully to see how it would land. "I know," Miriam said. "I also know he stopped. I don't yet know everything about why." She paused. "I intend to find out." Ida had looked at her for a long time after that. Whatever she was measuring, she appeared to reach a conclusion. She got up and went to a locked tin box at the back of the store and came back with 3 additional documents, contracts belonging to families who had given them to her for safekeeping, because they trusted her more than they trusted any institution in Coldwell. "Take these," she said. "Read them. Then tell me what you find." Miriam had taken them home in her market basket under the flour and the dried beans, and she had read them at the kitchen table after Callum went to bed. The language was identical across all 4 documents, not similar. Identical, the same phrasing, the same subordinate clause structure, the same placement on page 3 in a font precisely 2 points smaller than the rest of the text. People who read contracts for a living would catch it. People who trusted the man explaining the contract to them would not. The drafting style was one she had seen before, in Cincinnati, in a document that had been left on her desk by mistake 2 years ago. She had known this already. She had known it since before she arrived in Coldwell. But knowing a thing from a distance and holding the evidence of it in your hands at a kitchen table in Kansas at 11 o'clock at night were different experiences, and she allowed herself to feel the difference before she folded the documents carefully and put them in the lining of her traveling coat alongside the copy she had kept from Cincinnati. Then she went to bed and slept, and in the morning she made breakfast and did not say anything about what she had found. The morning Callum brought in the coffee himself, something he had not done before, had not seemed to consider his responsibility in the division of their domestic arrangements, was the morning she understood that something had shifted in him too. He set the cup down beside her at the kitchen table where she was working through her weekly accounting. He poured his own and sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The kitchen was warm. Outside, a meadowlark was working through its morning inventory of the near pasture. "The Percival family left yesterday," he said. "Moved their things to a sister's place in Abilene." "I heard," she said. "That makes 8. The meadowlark outside found something more interesting further out and moved on. The kitchen was very quiet. The Percivals had a daughter, Callum said. 12 years old. Used to ride past the property every morning on her way to the schoolhouse. She had a red coat. He looked at his coffee. I noticed it was gone 3 days before they told anyone they were leaving. Miriam set down her pen. She looked at him across the table. He was not looking at her. He was looking at a middle distance somewhere between the table and the window at something she could not see. And he was not trying to describe. This was not a man who had made peace with what he had done. This was a man who had built a very precise structure around it and lived inside the structure because the alternative was not manageable. She recognized this because she had built similar structures herself at other times around other things. Callum, she said. He looked up. What is in the cabinet? She said. He did not ask her which cabinet. He looked at her for a long moment with the particular quality of a man who has been carrying a weight for long enough that he has forgotten what not carrying it feels like, and is trying to remember whether setting it down is something he is still capable of doing. He got up. He took the key from the inner pocket of his vest. She had known it was there. She had simply not said so. And unlocked the cabinet. He stood back and let her look. The files were organized chronologically, 12 of them spanning 3 years. Each one was labeled with a family name and a date. Inside each, a copy of the land contract, handwritten notes in Callum's precise hand, recording what he had observed and verified. And in some cases, a letter from the family describing the meeting with Harlan Sess. He had been building a case. Miriam pulled out the earliest file and read the notes. They were the work of a trained investigator, methodical, free of editorializing tracking patterns across transactions, with the rigor of someone who knew that feelings were not evidence. She had spent 8 years adjacent to legal processes, and she could recognize the quality of documentation that would survive scrutiny. These would survive scrutiny. She had spent enough time in the Cincinnati office reading correspondence from federal land offices to know one thing more. The intake process for a contested transfer required all accompanying documentation to be examined as a single package. You could not submit one piece and withhold another. Everything traveled together, or nothing moved at all. She had read this in a procedural letter that Aldridge had received and not answered, and she had thought about it on and off for 2 years. She looked up from the file. These are thorough. I was a marshal for 11 years, he said. I know how to build a case. Then why? Because Harlan Sess walked onto this property 3 years ago, he said. The day after, I sent a letter to the federal land office in Wichita requesting a review of the county transaction records. He paused. He didn't threaten me. He sat at that table, and he gestured at the kitchen table without looking at it. And he told me that my brother Owen was living under a false name outside Dodge City. That Owen had left Missouri 17 years ago ahead of a charge that had never been resolved. That the statute of limitations on that charge had not expired. Another pause. And that if someone in Wichita received my letter and started asking questions about land records in this county, someone might also start asking questions about an unresolved matter in Missouri, and might find it easier than expected to locate the man involved. Miriam set the file down on the cabinet top. Owen, she said. My younger brother. He said this without emotion, which meant there was a great deal of emotion that had nowhere comfortable to go. The charge in Missouri was not what Harlan implied it was. Owen made a mistake. He was very young and he made a mistake, and he spent 17 years paying for it in ways that didn't have anything to do with the law. A pause. I couldn't send him back. The kitchen light came in at its flat afternoon angle and made long shadows across the floor. Miriam stood beside the open cabinet with 12 files in careful chronological order and looked at Callum Drought and thought about what it cost a man like this, a precise man, a man built around function and order and the specific gravity of doing what was right, to look at what was right and choose the other thing. She thought about how he had lived with that choice. She thought about the fence posts struck true in 3 hits instead of 5. You never withdrew the letter, she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. No. The letter is still in Wichita. I don't know what happened to it, he said carefully. I received no reply. But you didn't withdraw it, she said again. No, he said. I didn't. Miriam picked up the earliest file again and held it. She was thinking about a thing she had not told him yet. The document in her coat. The office in Cincinnati. The thread that connected all of this to something larger and more deliberate than a single opportunist with a well-cut suit and a talent for patient predation. She was thinking about when to say it, and how and whether the order of revelation mattered. She decided it did not. I need to tell you something, she said, about why I came to Coldwell. She told him the way she had learned to tell things that mattered without ornamentation, in the order they happened with the relevant details and without the ones that were only interesting. She told him about the document left on her desk. She told him about the drafting style she recognized in the Coldwell contracts. She told him about Aldridge in the offer and what she had said to him. She told him about the copy she had made folded into the lining of her coat, which she had carried from Cincinnati to Coldwell on the calculation, the careful, deliberate, long-considered calculation that a former marshal who had investigated this matter was more useful to her than any lawyer she could afford, or any federal office she could write to without knowing whether Harlan Sess had anyone positioned to intercept the correspondence. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a long time. You chose me specifically, he said. I chose this situation specifically, she said. You were part of it. And the marriage was the fastest way to be here, in a way that no one would look at twice. She paused. I want to be honest with you about that. He looked at her. Not with anger. She had prepared herself for anger and found herself slightly unprepared for the absence of it. He looked at her with the expression of a man completing a calculation. He had begun some time ago and had suspected would come out this way. The pause, he said, when you signed the register. She met his eyes. Yes. You were deciding. I had already decided, she said. I was making sure I had decided clearly. A pause. There's a difference. He stood with that for a moment. Then he crossed to the table and sat down and put both hands flat on the wood the way he did when he was thinking something through completely before he moved. The document from Cincinnati, he said. It links the drafting office to Aldridge and Howe. It links the style to a set of contracts I can testify I saw at Aldridge and Howe, she said carefully. That is not the same as a documented link, but it is a thread. Combined with the files in that cabinet. Combined with the files in that cabinet and the contracts I have from Ida Cray and 3 other families. Yes, she said. It is enough of a thread that someone in Wichita would pull it. If someone in Wichita received it. If that person was not in a position to make it disappear. Callum looked at his hands on the table. And Owen is the thing that stops you. A silence. I'm not asking you to send him back, Miriam said. I'm not asking you to do anything yet. I'm telling you what I have, and what I know, and what I think is possible because I think you have been sitting in this house with that cabinet locked for 3 years and no one to tell it to. And I think that is part of why you answered a letter from a woman in Cincinnati who was looking for a way out. She paused. Am I wrong? He looked up at her. No, he said. It was the flattest word she had ever heard him say. Harlan Sess rode onto the property 3 days later. Miriam was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse. She straightened and turned. A broad man on a good horse coming up the approach at the unhurried pace of a man who considered himself welcome. He wore a coat that had cost more than most Coldwell residents spent on clothing in a year. And he had the kind of physical ease that comes not from confidence, but from the long experience of never having been seriously opposed. He reined in near the porch and looked around the property with the slow, assessing eye of someone taking inventory. Then he looked at her. Callum came out of the barn. The change in him was immediate and specific. He did not raise his voice or reach for anything. He simply stopped walking and stood, and the stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness, denser, more deliberate. The stillness of a man placing himself between something and something else. Harlan, he said. The man on the horse smiled the way people smile when they want you to understand the smile is a controlled choice. Drought. It's been a while. His eyes moved to Miriam. Didn't know you'd taken a wife. Now you do, Callum said. Harlan's eyes stayed on Miriam. She did not look away. She was reading him the way she read documents, looking at what was visible and trying to understand what it was covering. What she saw was a man who was not surprised by her presence, a man who had expected her or someone like her and was cataloging the specific version of her that had arrived. I heard you're from Cincinnati, Harlan said to her. His voice was pleasant and conversational, which was its own form of information. Long way to come. It is, Miriam said. Aldridge and Howe wasn't it fine office? I've had occasion to work with them. The sentence landed between them in the morning air. Miriam watched it land and kept her face exactly as it had been, and said, I wouldn't know. I was a clerk. Of course, Harlan said pleasantly. He looked back at Callum. Just passing through. Wanted to pay my respects. His eyes moved back to Miriam one final time, slow and deliberate and carrying a specific message she understood completely. I know why you're here. Be careful about what you think you're doing. Respects paid, Callum said. Harlan touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse and rode back down the approach without hurry, without looking back. Callum stood watching until the horse cleared the property line. Then he turned and walked to the barn. Miriam took off her garden gloves and folded them and followed him. He was standing at his workbench with both hands flat on the surface and his head down, in the posture of a man absorbing something. She stopped in the barn doorway. "He knows about Cincinnati," she said. "Yes." "He knew before he came here." "Yes." She stood with that for a moment. The barn smelled of hay and leather, and the particular mineral smell of old wood. Outside, a hawk was making long, slow circles over the near pasture. "He came to show us he knows," she said. "Not to do anything, just to show us." "That's how he works," Callum said. "He doesn't apply pressure directly. He lets you understand that pressure is available." He paused. "Then he waits to see what you do with that understanding." Miriam leaned against the barn door frame and looked at the property beyond the fence line, the kitchen garden, the road going west toward Coldwell. She was thinking about the document in her coat. She was thinking about 12 files in a locked cabinet. She was thinking about Ida Cray's 3 months and the Edelman boy walking down the lane in boots too large for him. "He told you about Owen," she said. "The same way, just the information, waiting to see what you do." "Yes." "And you stopped." "Yes." "And he counted on you stopping again." Callum lifted his head and looked at her. "He came here today," Miriam said, "because he found out about Cincinnati, and he wants to know whether I'm going to stop you or whether you're going to let me go further than you went alone." She met his eyes. "He's trying to find out which kind of problem I am." Callum looked at her for a long time. "And which kind are you?" She pushed off from the doorframe. "The kind he should have been more careful about," she said, and went back to the garden. That night, after the dishes were done and the fire had burned low enough that the room had settled into its evening warmth, she sat down across from him with the document from her coat and put it on the table between them. He picked it up. He read it the way she had read the files, completely, without rushing. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the wall above her head for a moment. "This links the contract language to Aldrich," he said. "It demonstrates the language was in use at Aldrich before the Coldwell contracts were drafted," she said, "which combined with the consistency across your 12 families. 8, he said. There are more I haven't verified. Combined with the consistency across the cases you have documented, and my testimony about where I first saw this drafting style, gives a federal investigator enough to open a formal inquiry." She paused. "If the investigator is not positioned to suppress it, which means we can't send it through normal channels." "No," she said. "We need someone specific. Someone outside this county and outside the immediate reach of whoever Harlan reports to." She paused again. "I have a name. A federal land commissioner in Topeka. I found him through correspondence at the Cincinnati office. He's been auditing transaction records in 3 Kansas counties. He's not from here, and he doesn't owe anyone in Wichita anything." Callum looked at the document on the table. Then he looked at her. "You came here with all of this already arranged," he said. "I came here with a plan," she said. "Plans change when you meet the actual people involved." She looked at the document. "I didn't know about Owen when I arrived." I didn't know the full scope of what you had in the cabinet. A pause. I didn't know you. He was quiet. The plan as it stands, she said, requires something I cannot do on my own. It requires someone Harlan has no hold over. Someone whose next action he cannot predict because the thing that was meant to stop them has been removed. She looked up at him. As long as Owen is a pressure point, Harlan knows where to push. Callum sat very still. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. I'm telling you what the situation is. She paused. You already know this. You've known it for 3 years. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the Kansas dark was complete and windless, the kind of night that makes a house feel very small against the plain. Callum stood up. He took his coat from the hook by the door. He put it on and then his hat. Miriam looked at him. Where are you going? There's something I need to do, he said. I need you to stay here tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. Callum, I'll be back before morning, he said. Dodge City is 4 hours east by the road along the river. The door opened. The cold came in for a moment. Then the door closed behind him, and she heard his boots on the porch boards, and then the sound of the horse being brought out of the barn, and then hoofbeats going east diminishing, and then nothing but the fire and the dark and the flat open silence of the Kansas night. She sat at the table for a while. Then she got up and added wood to the fire and made tea, and sat back down with the document in front of her and the 12 files she had quietly removed from the cabinet before dinner and arranged in order on her side of the table. She worked until the fire needed tending again. She worked until the tea went cold. She worked with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who has learned that the most useful thing she can do in the space between deciding and acting is to make sure when the time comes that everything is exactly right. Outside, the dark held its ground. The plain was silent in every direction. And somewhere east along the river road, Callum Drought was riding toward a reckoning he had postponed for 3 years because the woman sitting at his kitchen table had said without softening it, as long as Owen is a pressure point, Harlan knows where to push. She had not told him what to do. She had simply told him the truth clearly enough that he could see it without looking away, which was, she had learned over many years of careful observation, the only kind of help that actually worked. He came back at 4:30 in the morning. She was still at the table. He came in quietly, the way a man comes in when he's been out all night and is not certain of his welcome, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with his coat still on, and the fine, dry scatter that passes for snow in Kansas before real winter caught in the brim of his hat. He looked at the table, at the files arranged in the order she had put them, at the document from Cincinnati, at her sitting straight-backed across from where he usually sat with a cup of cold tea at her elbow and a piece of paper in her hand. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and took out a folded document and set it on the table in the only empty space there was. She looked at it without picking it up. Owen signed it willingly, Callum said. He's been waiting for years for someone to let him. He paused. He said it's a relief, that the weight of it was worse than whatever comes next will be. Miriam looked at the document. A voluntary statement, the kind that filed with the right court would resolve a warrant and remove a lever. She looked up at him. His face was weathered and tired, and something else, something lighter than she had seen in it before, as though something that had been anchored there had come loose, and he was still deciding what to do with the change in his own weight. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat down. She made the coffee, and in the hour before dawn, at a kitchen table in Coldwell, Kansas, with the files of 12 families spread between them and the cold coming in at the base of the door, and the first gray beginning to show at the window, they began to build together carefully, with the particular precision of two people who had each been doing this alone for too long. The thing that would end it. The plan took 4 days to build correctly. Miriam had learned in 8 years of working adjacent to people who moved money and land and legal language around, with the confidence of men who believed such things belonged to them by nature, that the difference between a plan that worked and a plan that almost worked was almost always in the preparation. Almost works were how people got hurt. Correctness was slow and ingrained and worth every hour it required. So they were slow about it. Callum sent Owen's statement by private courier to a court recorder in Topeka. Not the nearest court, not the most convenient, but the one whose clerk he had corresponded with 11 years ago on an extradition matter, and whose name he still remembered because reliable people were worth remembering. He enclosed a brief letter explaining the circumstances. He did not explain more than was necessary. Miriam wrote to the federal land commissioner in Topeka. His name was Everett Marsh, and she had found it in a letter she had read 2 years ago in Cincinnati that had been addressed to Aldridge and had not been meant for her eyes. Marsh had been conducting a quiet audit of transaction records in 3 Kansas counties. He had been doing this quietly because the alternative, doing it loudly, had a tendency to make records disappear before they could be examined. She wrote to him at his home address, not his office, in an envelope that gave no indication of its origin. Inside, she listed in precise numbered sequence what she had the document from Cincinnati, demonstrating the drafting style Callum's 12 files. 4 original contracts from Coldwell families and her own testimony regarding the connection between Aldridge and Howe, and the land acquisition company Harlan Sess represented. She wrote, "I am not asking for anything except that this reaches someone who will read it. I believe you are that person. I believe this because of the letter you sent to Aldridge and Howe in September of 1877, which you should know was read by at least one person who was not its intended recipient, and who has been thinking about what to do with that knowledge ever since." She sealed the envelope and addressed it in a hand different enough from her usual to be unrecognizable to anyone who had seen her sign a register. She gave it to Callum, who gave it to a cattle driver passing through Coldwell on his way north, with payment enough to ensure it would travel faster than any post. Then they waited. Reverend Boone came to the property on the 3rd day. He came on foot, which told her he had not wanted his horse seen at their gate. And he came in the late afternoon when the light was going and the road was mostly empty. Miriam saw him from the kitchen window and went to the door before he could knock. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say and has already lost confidence in the version he prepared. "Mrs. Drought," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and declined the chair she offered, and stood in the kitchen with his hat rotating slowly in his hands. And she waited. "Harlan Sess came to see me yesterday," he said. She had expected this. She had expected it 2 days ago, which meant Harlan was moving more slowly than she had estimated, which was either good or bad, and she had not yet determined which. What did he want? She said. He wanted to know whether I had spoken with you, Boone said. Beyond the ordinary. He paused. And whether you had asked me anything about the contracts I witnessed. What did you tell him? That you had called on me in a pastoral capacity, Boone said, and that we had discussed nothing of a legal or contractual nature. He stopped turning his hat. Which is technically true. Our conversation was not strictly speaking legal or contractual in nature. Miriam looked at him. Why are you here, Reverend? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I have been telling myself for 2 years that the reason I signed those documents was that I did not know what was in them. Which is true. And I have been telling myself that the reason I did not ask harder questions was that the man presenting them was persuasive, and the families seemed satisfied. And it was easier in the moment to believe that I had done due diligence. He paused. Which is less true. The kitchen was very still. I am here, he said, because I would like to know whether there is something useful I can still do, and because I would rather know that I asked than know that I didn't. Miriam looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Callum had told her about Boone, that he had been in Coldwell for 20 years, that he was not a bad man, that he was the kind of man who found it easier to believe the comfortable thing and spent a great deal of energy constructing reasons why the comfortable thing was also the correct thing. She thought about the difference between that kind of man and a corrupt one. It was not a small difference. She went to the table and picked up one of the blank sheets she had been using for notes. She set it in front of him with a pen. One statement, she said, in your own words, that you witnessed the signing of these contracts and were not provided with the full content of the subordinate clauses on page 3 before signing as witness. Nothing more than that. No interpretation. No accusation. She paused. Just what you know to be true. He looked at the paper. His hand, when he picked up the pen, was not entirely steady, but it steadied as he wrote the way hands sometimes do when the decision has already been made and the body is simply catching up. He wrote 4 sentences. He signed his name. He set the pen down. Miriam picked up the paper and read it. It was exactly what she had asked for, precise, factual, and written in the careful hand of a man who had chosen very late to be useful. Thank you, she said. He put his hat back on. At the door, he paused without turning around. Mrs. Drought, I don't know what you're planning, but I want you to know that whatever it is, it should have been done 2 years ago. By someone more capable than me. He went out. She heard his footsteps on the porch, and then on the frozen ground going back toward the road. And then nothing. She set Boone's statement with the other documents and went to find Callum in the barn. On the 4th day, a letter came from Topeka. It was addressed to Callum, which was how she had expected it would come. Marsh would not write to a woman he did not know. At an address he could not verify, but he would write to a former marshal. Because former marshals were a category of person that federal land commissioners occasionally found useful. The letter was brief. It said that the matter described in recent correspondence was of interest to the commissioner's ongoing work in the region, It said that a formal document intake would be possible in Coldwell if the relevant materials could be made available for examination. It said that this intake would require a properly witnessed transfer, which was to say, a transfer signed by a legally competent adult in the presence of the materials described. It did not say, "I believe you." It did not need to. What it said underneath what it said was, "Send me something I can use and sign your name to it." Miriam read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the table and the files and Boone's statement and the document from Cincinnati and the 4 contracts from the Coldwell families. And she thought for the first time since she had arrived in this county that the shape of the thing was complete enough to see whole. That evening she told Callum what she intended to do. He said no immediately, not loudly. Callum Drought did not do anything loudly, but he said it with the complete flatness of a man who has decided. And she had learned in 3 months of living in his company that complete flatness meant something different from ordinary refusal. Ordinary refusal was a negotiating position. Complete flatness was a wall. "I heard you," she said. "Tell me why." "Because Harlan Sess will be expecting something," he said. "He came here. He went to Boone. He's watching us. If you walk into his office to sign a document as a witness, he will know you're doing more than witnessing." "Yes," she said. "He will. Then, he will know I'm doing more than witnessing," she said, "and he will let me do it anyway, because he believes that whatever I sign he can manage, because he has managed everything that has been put in front of him for 3 years. And the one person who was close to stopping him stopped voluntarily, and now that person's wife, a woman, he has already assessed and found, I think, somewhat more manageable than the evidence suggests, is walking into his office." She paused. "He will let me in because he thinks he has already won." Callum looked at her across the kitchen table, and if he's right, he's not. "Miriam." He said her name the way he said things that mattered without inflection, which made it carry more weight than if he had raised his voice. "You are proposing to sit across from a man who already knows you worked at Aldridge, who has 3 years of experience neutralizing people who knew more than you do, and hand him a document you have signed." "A document I have signed incorrectly," she said. A pause. "The transfer intake requires a witness signature in a specific position on the form," she said. "If I sign in the wrong position, not the witness line but the addendum space on page 3, the transfer is invalid on its face. It triggers a mandatory review. Any document submitted as part of that transfer comes under examination automatically." She paused. "I also intend to write 4 words in the addendum space before I sign." She told him the 4 words. He was quiet for a long time. "That invalidates the transfer and creates a record," he said slowly. "A record that travels to Topeka with the intake packet, where Everett Marsh has already indicated he is expecting to receive materials relevant to his audit." She paused. "Harlan will not know what I have written until after I have left. By the time he understands what has happened, the packet will be with the courier." Callum looked at her. She could see him working through it, not looking for flaws because he distrusted her, but because he was the kind of man who looked for flaws in everything he cared about, because caring about things had taught him that flaws were expensive. "He'll know it was deliberate," Callum said finally. "Yes. And he'll come here." "Probably." Miriam. Callum. She said his name the way he had said hers, without inflection, with weight. You rode to Dodge City and back in a single night to remove the one hold he had over you. Owen's statement is filed. There is nothing left that Harlan Sess can threaten you with. She looked at him steadily. What will he do when he comes here? Tell people that the former marshal's wife signed a document incorrectly, that she wrote 4 words in the wrong space. She paused. He has spent 3 years doing everything through paper and patience and the appearance of legality. He will not abandon that method now. It is all he has. The fire made its small sounds. The wind was up outside, moving through the eaves in the way it moved in November, with intention, as though it meant to stay. You've been doing this alone for a long time, Callum said. She met his eyes. I know, she said. That's not a criticism, he said. It's an observation. He paused. You came here with a plan you built alone. You've been adjusting it alone since you arrived. Even now, the way you're explaining this to me, you're not asking me to decide with you. You've already decided, and you're presenting it for approval. Miriam was quiet. It was true. She knew it was true. She had been doing things alone for long enough that collaboration had become something she narrated rather than practiced presenting conclusions, rather than building them in company. Because building them in company required trusting that the other person's contribution would be worth the exposure of the unfinished thinking. Then tell me what I'm missing, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Harlan knows you. He doesn't know me not the way I am now, with Owen's statement filed and nothing left to lose. When you go into that office, you should not go alone. Not because you need protection. He paused. Because you deserve to not have to do it alone. She looked at him across the table for a long time. You'll wait outside, she said. I'll wait outside, he said. I won't come in unless you need me to. I won't need you to. I know that, he said. I'll be there anyway. They sat in the firelit kitchen in the November evening and worked through every detail until there was nothing left to question. And then they went to bed and slept, which was itself a form of decision. The decision that they had done what could be done, and that what remained was to go and do it. Harlan Sess had taken a room at the Coldwell Hotel and converted its small sitting area into a temporary office with the ease of a man who was accustomed to conducting business in rented spaces. When Miriam arrived at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, he was reviewing papers at a writing table positioned to face the door, which told her he had been expecting her, or expecting someone, and had arranged himself accordingly. He stood when she came in. Good manners were part of the method. Mrs. Drought, he said. What a pleasant surprise. It was not a surprise to either of them, and they both knew it. She sat down in the chair across from his table without being invited, and set her hands in her lap and looked at him with the expression she had developed over 8 years for dealing with men who assumed that pleasantness was a form of control. You have a document transfer for the Cray property, she said. I understand you need a local witness of standing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat back down unhurried and opened the folder on his table. That's correct. The final transfer for the west parcel. A formality at this stage, the option has already been exercised. This simply completes the county recording. "I'd like to review the document," she said. "Of course." He slid it across the table. She picked it up and read it. All of it. She took her time not to perform thoroughness, but because the document deserved thorough reading and she was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. Harlan watched her read with the controlled patience of a man who has done this many times before and knows how it goes. On page 3, in a font 2 points smaller than the rest, the clause was exactly where she had known it would be. It was the same language, identical word for word to the clause in Ida Cray's original contract and all the others she had read. Of course it was. She looked up from the document. "The clause on page 3, she said. "Paragraph 4, subsection B. Was this explained to Mrs. Cray when she signed the original agreement?" Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, Harlan. Cess did not alarm easily. A recalibration. The same recalibration she had seen in Callum's face the day she arrived, but with a different quality behind it. "The agreement was explained in full," he said, pleasantly. "The clause specifically," she said. "This clause. Was it read aloud or paraphrased during the meeting, Mrs. Drought?" The pleasantness was still there, but had become structural, something maintained rather than felt. "I understand you have a background in clerical work. These documents are necessarily technical. The explanation provided was appropriate to the circumstances and the—" "I'll need a moment," she said. She picked up the pen from his table. She turned to page 3. She located the addendum space below the subordinate clause. The space left by convention for notations barely large enough for a line of text. The kind of space that exists in contracts, because the law requires it, and that no one ever uses because no one who is supposed to use it is ever told it's there. She wrote 4 words, not explained to signatory. Then she signed her name, not on the witness line at the bottom of page 4, where her signature would have completed the transfer. In the addendum space directly below the 4 words where her signature would not complete anything, but would instead attach her name permanently and irrevocably to a notation that questioned the validity of the clause itself. She set down the pen and slid the document back across the table. Harlan Cess looked at it. He looked at what she had written. He looked at where she had signed. In 3 years of conducting business in Kansas and surrounding territories, she had the impression this had not happened to him before. The pleasantness left his face entirely. What remained was not anger. She had prepared herself for anger and would have known how to manage it. What remained was the expression of a man rapidly calculating how much damage had been done and whether it could be contained, which was both more alarming and, she realized, more useful. A man calculating damage was a man acknowledging that damage had occurred. "That signature," he said very carefully, "is not in the correct position." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." "The transfer will not be valid." "No," she agreed, "it won't." He looked at her with the full focused attention of a man who has abruptly revised his assessment of the situation he is in. She let him look. "You understand what you've done," he said. It was not quite a question. "I've made a notation in the addendum space provided for that purpose and signed my name to it," she said. "I've also declined to sign as witness in the designated position, which means the transfer is incomplete and will require review before it can be recorded." She paused. This document, along with the intake packet I've prepared, will be forwarded to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Topeka, where I believe there is an ongoing audit of transaction records in this county. The 4 words I've written are factual and can be corroborated by the signatory of the original agreement. She stood up. "You've been building something very carefully for 3 years," she said. "The paperwork is thorough. The legal construction is sound. The individual transactions are each defensible in isolation." She picked up her bag. But a pattern is not a transaction. And when someone begins examining the pattern with the right documents in front of them, the individual defenses stop working. Harlan Sess did not move. "Mrs. Cray has 3 months left on her option date," Miriam said. "The review process takes 4 to 6 months. The math is not in your favor." She walked to the door. "Mrs. Drought." His voice behind her had lost all of its social register. What was left was flat and direct and entirely honest for the first time since she had walked in. "You should be very clear about what you're starting." She stopped at the door. She turned and looked at him one final time. "I'm ending it," she said. "There's a difference." She went out. Callum was standing on the boardwalk across the street with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the door of the hotel. When she came out, he crossed without hurrying and fell into step beside her, and they walked back toward where the wagon was hitched without speaking. After a block, he said, "How did it go?" "As expected," she said. He nodded. They walked another half block. "Did he threaten you?" "He started to," she said. "He stopped when he realized it wasn't going to change anything." They reached the wagon. He helped her up and then got up himself and took the reins and sat for a moment without starting the horse. "Miriam," he said. She looked at him. "The 4 words," he said. "Was that always the plan?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. "The mechanism was always the plan," she said. "The specific language came to me the night you went to Dodge City, when I was sitting at the table with the files, and I had 4 hours to think without being interrupted." She paused. "It's what the addendum space exists for. Someone put it in the contract law because they understood that witnesses might need to record discrepancies. No one uses it because no one tells witnesses it's there, until someone who reads contracts for a living signs one." "Until that," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he clicked his tongue at the horse and they moved out onto the main road heading west, back toward the property, and Coldwell arranged itself behind them in the flat November light. Harlan Sess left town 4 days later. He did not say goodbye to anyone, which was noted. He did not leave a forwarding address at the hotel, which was also noted. The people of Coldwell were practiced observers of departures. They had seen enough of them in recent years to have developed a taxonomy, and the consensus formed and circulated without much discussion was that this one had the quality of a man leaving because it was better to leave than to stay, which was a different thing from a man who had simply concluded his business. Nobody said this directly, but Mrs. Pruitt mentioned to her husband that Harlan Sess had settled his hotel bill in cash 2 days early, which she considered a significant data point. The man at the telegraph office mentioned to no one in particular that he had sent a wire to Wichita the morning before he left. The boy at the livery said the horse had been pushed hard. Coldwell filed all of this away and waited to see what came next, which was what Coldwell had always done and which it was reasonably good at. What came next arrived in stages the way consequences tend to, when they are the result of careful preparation rather than sudden action. The Federal Land Commissioner's office in Topeka acknowledged receipt of the intake packet within 2 weeks addressed to Callum as expected, saying very little beyond the fact of receipt and the fact that the materials were under review. 3 weeks after that, a longer letter arrived containing specific questions about the documentation, the kind of questions asked by someone who has read the materials and found them credible and is now building the structure needed to act on them. Callum answered them. Miriam reviewed his answers and suggested 2 additions. He made them without comment, which was his way of indicating that he thought she was right. She filed both letters with the rest of the correspondence and did not read them again, because what was done, and reading it again would not make it more done. Ida Cray received a formal notice 6 weeks after Miriam's visit to the hotel. The notice informed her that the transfer of her property had not been recorded due to an irregularity in the witness documentation, and that the option exercise date had been suspended pending review. It was written in the particular language of bureaucratic holding patterns, but underneath that language, what it said was, "Nothing is happening to your land while we look at this." She read it 3 times. Then she put it in the tin box at the back of the store where she kept the things that mattered, and she opened the store and served the first customer of the morning, and did not tell anyone what the letter had said. But the woman who ran the dry goods store at the east end of town had a quality about her in the weeks that followed that the people of Coldwell noticed without quite being able to name something that had been braced in her for a very long time and had been released. The Edelman family did not come back to Coldwell. They had already committed to the sister's place in Abilene, and a life once moved is difficult to move back. But a letter arrived for Otto's mother in December, postmarked Coldwell with no return address, informing her that the transaction on their property was among those under formal federal review, and that they might wish to retain legal representation. The letter listed the name of a lawyer in Hutchinson, who had, it appeared recently, agreed to take several related cases at a reduced rate. Miriam had written the letter herself. She did not mention this to anyone. Reverend Boone gave a sermon in December that was not technically about anything in particular. It was ostensibly about the winter passage in Ecclesiastes, the one about seasons and purposes and the appropriate time for things. But toward the end, he said something that was not from Ecclesiastes and that he appeared to have written himself about the difference between a community that watches things happen and a community that understands, however slowly, however imperfectly, that watching is not the same as being uninvolved. He did not say it eloquently, but he said it clearly, which was better. The woman named Mrs. Pruitt remarked to her husband afterward that the sermon had been unusual. Her husband said he thought it had been pretty good. Mrs. Pruitt considered this and said she supposed that depended on where you'd been sitting. The first hard snow came in January, early enough to surprise people who should have known better than to be surprised by January snow in Kansas. It came overnight, and in the morning the property stretched out white and level in every direction, and the fence posts Miriam had identified in the fall stood straight in the new snow, properly set, which Callum had attended to in October, without being asked again. She was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee when he came in from the morning feeding. He stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat and poured his own coffee and came to stand beside her at the window. They looked at the snow together. "The Harker family's land is still in review," he said. "That's the last of the ones I had files on." "It'll take time," she said. "These things take time." "I know." He paused. Marsh wrote again. "He wants the files formally transferred to his office." "We should do that soon," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "When that's done, when everything is transferred and the review is in their hands, it's out of ours." She looked at the snow. "Yes." "I don't know how I feel about that," he said. She thought about this honestly. "I think it feels like setting something down that you've been carrying for a long time," she said, "and not knowing immediately whether that's a relief or a loss, because you've been carrying it long enough that you forgot what your hands feel like empty." He was quiet beside her. "Both," he said finally. "I think it's both." She nodded. Outside, the snow was the particular brilliant white of a clear winter morning, and the sky above it was the particular clear blue that Kansas produced only after a hard freeze had cleared the air of everything that usually complicated it. "Callum," she said. I want you to know something." She looked at the snow and not at him, which was the way she said things that were harder to say than the practical ones. "When I came here, the way I came here, what I was doing and why, I don't regret it. I want to be clear about that. I made a calculation and I stand behind it." She paused. "But I also want to be clear that somewhere along the way, the calculation stopped being the reason I was here." He did not say anything immediately. She continued looking at the snow. "I don't know exactly when that happened. I noticed that it did." He set down his coffee cup on the windowsill. After a moment, he reached out and put his hand over hers, where it was wrapped around her cup. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, just a hand placed over a hand with the deliberate quality of a man who does not make gestures he doesn't mean. She did not move her hand. She did not move any part of her posture, which was the way she indicated that she was receiving something completely. They stood at the window in the winter morning and looked at the snow and the fence line and the land, which was cold and worked and not particularly beautiful, except in the particular way that things are beautiful when they are exactly what they are, without apology, and you are standing beside someone who sees them the same way you do. In the spring, Ida Cray received a formal determination from the Federal Land Commissioner's office. The original transfer agreement had been found to contain material omissions in the presentation of its terms to the signatory, rendering the subordinate clause on page 3 unenforceable. The option exercise was invalidated. The land remained hers. She read the letter in the back of the store alone on a Tuesday morning before she opened. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she got up, unlocked the front door, and turned the sign to open. 3 of the 7 families received similar determinations in the following months. 2 more had cases still under review. The remaining 2 had transferred properties that the commissioner's office determined could not be recovered on the current evidence, though the file remained open. It was not everything. It was never going to be everything. Miriam had known this from the beginning, had known it in Cincinnati when she made the copy, had known it on the stage to Coldwell, had known it sitting across from Ida Cray in the back of the dry goods store while Callum waited with the wagon on the main road. The law was not a mechanism for perfect correction. It was a mechanism for making the cost of wrongdoing higher than the benefit consistently enough, over time enough, that the wrongdoing became less attractive. What they had built, she and Callum and Ida and Boone and Owen Drought, signing his name in Dodge City in the small hours, was not justice in the complete sense. It was a thread pulled. And threads pulled when the fabric has been woven a certain way tend to keep unraveling after the hand that pulled them has moved on. Harlan says she learned through Callum's correspondence with Marsh, had returned to the East, and had not appeared in any further Kansas County records. Whether this was permanent was not something she could know. She noted it and moved on. The autumn after the first snow, Miriam sat on the covered porch of the property in the long afternoon light, with a cup of tea and the particular quality of stillness that comes from having finished something that needed finishing. The kitchen garden had done well. The fence line was sound. From inside the house, she could hear Callum at the desk by the front window, writing the last of the correspondence to Marsh's office, the formal transfer of files, the completion of their part of it. His handwriting was the same as the 4 sentences he had sent her in Cincinnati. Clear, unornamented, the hand of a man who had stopped trying to make his writing anything other than what it was. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought about the documents she had carried in the lining of her coat across however many miles through the stage journey, and the brief ceremony in the cedar smelling room, and the 6 weeks of careful observation before she understood enough to move. She thought about what it had weighed, that document. Not literally it was 1 page, but in the particular way that things weigh when you are carrying them alone. When they have been yours to carry so long that you have forgotten what you were before you picked them up. She no longer had it. It was in Topeka in a file cabinet in a federal office doing the work she had always meant it to do. It had been out of her hands for months. She noticed on most days that she did not miss it. The door opened and Callum came out and sat down beside her. Without asking whether she wanted company, which was how she knew she had stopped being someone whose desire for solitude he was uncertain about. He sat down, the way he sat in general, without excess, without apology, and looked at the land in the late afternoon light. After a while, he said, "Marsh closed the formal intake today. Everything's in their hands now." "Good," she said. "He wrote something at the bottom of the letter," Callum said. "He said, and I'm giving you the substance of it, that whatever method was used to document and transmit this case, it was among the more thoroughly prepared intakes he had received in 11 years of this work." Miriam looked at the fence line. "He's a thorough man," she said. "He would notice that." "He would," Callum said. A pause. He asked if either of us would be willing to consult on 2 other counties where similar patterns have been identified. She looked at him. "He asked for both of us," Callum said, "by name." The afternoon light was long and gold on the plain, and the kitchen garden along the south wall had the ragged abundance of a summer's end. And somewhere past the fence line, a meadowlark was making its last remarks about the day before. The light made such remarks impractical. She looked at the land worked and leveled theirs by the simple accumulated fact of being the people who got up every morning and dealt with what it required. And she thought about Everett Marsh in Topeka, and the other counties and the other families who had signed documents in the careful presence of men with good suits and patient voices. "Tell me what the other counties looked like," she said. Callum reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded letter. He unfolded it and smoothed it on his knee and began to read, and she listened, and the afternoon held its light a little longer than it had any practical reason to, the way afternoons sometimes do in Kansas in the fall, as though the day understands that what is happening in it is worth the extra time and is willing to provide it. Neither of them said anything about what this meant for what came next. They did not need to. They sat together on the porch until the light was gone and the plain was dark in every direction. And then they went inside.